I never thought I'd stand on my own land staring down a concrete wall built to cut me off from everything my family had spent 3 generations building. But there I was, gripping the wheel of my old Ford so tight my knuckles went white, staring at the line of towering Jersey barriers stretching across the only driveway to my farm. The evening sun was slipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over fields of golden wheat to the right and rows of tall, rustling corn to the left. And right there, standing with that same smug expression she always wore, was Karen Whitfield, bright orange hard hat perched on her perfectly coiffed hair, clipboard clutched tight to her chest like a queen overseeing her conquered territory. "You should have accepted our offer," she said, her voice as syrupy sweet as poison, while behind her a crane operator gently lowered yet another 3-ton concrete slab into place. What she didn't know, what none of those Whispering Pines folks knew, was that those demolition machines scattered across the county, visible in the distance if you looked close enough, weren't just rental equipment. I owned them. Every bulldozer, every concrete crusher, every dump truck bore the logo of Collins & Sons Demolition, the company my father and I built from scratch while we worked this same soil. But that night, I wasn't thinking about my business empire. I was thinking about my daughter, still resting in her hospital bed after delivering my first granddaughter, and about how I'd raced home in high spirits, eager to bring fresh flowers and news of good health, only to slam on my brakes and nearly tear the steering wheel off when I found my farm sealed off behind military-grade concrete. I threw the truck into park, grabbed my hat, and stormed toward her, my boots kicking up dust from the very driveway my grandfather had carved out with his own hands back in 1946. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I bellowed. She didn't flinch. In fact, her smile only widened. "Enforcing property boundaries, Mr. Collins, as outlined in the notice we delivered last week." Notice? I hadn't seen a damn thing. But then it hit me, she'd timed this while I was at the hospital. She knew. She'd waited until I was away welcoming new life into the world to try and bury my family's legacy in concrete. I drove back down the road that night, heart pounding and blood boiling, forced to park half a mile away and hike across muddy backfields just to reach my own front porch. Each heavy step through thick, clinging mud only made my resolve harden. The house was quiet, the porch light flickering faintly, and inside the kitchen, I flicked on the old fluorescent fixture that buzzed like it always had. I spread out 7 decades of paperwork across the kitchen table, property records, aerial photos, county surveys. My hands trembled with rage, but my mind was sharp as a chisel. I hadn't survived droughts, floods, and market collapses to let some suburban tyrant in designer heels and pearls erase my family's history. I sat for hours, combing through every inch of every document, tracing old survey lines with the precision my father had taught me. He always said, "Know your land down to the inch." That old surveyor's transit of his was still tucked away in the hall closet, and I went to get it, dusting it off like an heirloom sword ready to be drawn. By midnight, I was comparing satellite imagery on my laptop with photographs from the county archives and the weathered black and white prints taken by my grandfather himself, standing next to his first tractor with this farmhouse in the background. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. Not only was my driveway exactly where it had been for over 70 years, but the grand Italian stone entrance that Karen had boasted about at every HOA meeting, the one with fountains and ornamental iron gates, was sitting a full 7 feet onto my land. Worse still, the drainage ditches they'd dug along the community's edge weren't just sloppy, they were channeling runoff straight into federally protected wetlands on my northern property line. That wasn't just careless. That was criminal. But the real gut punch came when I found the fine print. Buried deep in HOA documents obtained through public records was the smoking gun. Karen hadn't just pushed for these barriers. She had orchestrated a secret emergency board vote at 2 in the morning, bypassing resident notification requirements. That vote authorized the use of HOA funds for land seizure actions under a quietly amended bylaw written in legal jargon so dense only a trained eye could spot it. That bylaw allowed the HOA to claim adjacent property access points with disputed boundaries, a clause tailor-made for my driveway. My eyes burned from the strain, but I kept going, digging further into county permits and construction contracts. That's when I found the names. The surveying company that provided the falsified maps? Owned by Karen's brother-in-law. The construction company placing the barriers? Her sons. Every piece of this assault was a family scheme, carefully planned to steal what generations of honest work had built. But the part that made me sit back in stunned silence, the part that made my stomach turn, was the discovery that she'd done this before. Two elderly farmers from just down the road, the Hendersons and the McIntyres, had been forced off their land in nearly identical schemes over the last 2 years. The McIntyres had lost everything. Henderson had died not long after being pushed out, and the whispers around town were that the stress of losing the farm had broken his heart. And now she'd come for me. I picked up my phone and called Sam, my son, the one running Collins & Sons Demolition while I focused on the farm these days. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Dad? Everything okay?" "I became a grandpa today," I said flatly, "and someone's trying to make sure I never get to enjoy it." I laid out everything I'd found. There was a long silence on the other end, then a low whistle. "How many machines do you need, Dad?" "All of them. Bulldozers, crushers, dump trucks, I want everything we've got here by dawn." "You got it," he said without hesitation. "That's over $2 million in equipment. This is about more than money. This is about your grandfather's promise, my father's legacy, and the right to stand on our land without asking permission from crooks." I hung up and immediately dialed Tom Whitaker, my lawyer and oldest friend. He answered sounding half awake but attentive. "I need every property record, easement, and historical survey we've got, and every public document you can pull on Whispering Pines. I need you here at 6 sharp." "Copy that," he said, no questions asked. I poured a stiff drink and sat by the fire, staring at that old photo of Grandpa Collins, his hand resting on the wheel of that tractor with pride written all over his face. They'd tried to erase men like him, men like me, from the land. But they'd underestimated the weight of history and the force of resolve forged over 3 generations. Outside, the wind rustled through the fields. But in the distance, I heard something else. Faint, but unmistakable, the low rumble of diesel engines on the highway. My machines were already on the move. By the time the first light cracked over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in strokes of soft amber and pale gold, I was already standing on the rise behind the house, the chill of morning air sharp in my lungs and the weight of generations resting heavy on my shoulders. I took a long sip of coffee from the same battered thermos my father carried into these fields and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The sound reached me first, deep, steady thunder rolling across the valley. Then they came into view over the ridge, 5 bulldozers, 3 excavators, 7 dump trucks, 2 barrier crushers, and a mobile crane that could lift a house off its foundation. All of them gleaming in yellow and black, each one bearing the Collins & Sons Demolition logo in bold lettering on their flanks. Pickup trucks followed, loaded with over 30 men and women I'd employed for years, men whose families I'd seen grow up around my business, whose loyalty I never doubted. And leading the convoy, his pickup's antenna proudly flying the American flag, was Sam. He pulled up beside me and stepped out, his face set and determined. We lined the equipment along the eastern property line. Not threatening. Just present. A silent wall of iron and power, making one thing clear, we would not be pushed. As the engines idled, lights began to flicker on in Whispering Pines. One by one, doors opened, and residents stepped out in bathrobes and slippers, coffee mugs clutched tight, blinking in disbelief at the fortress of machinery now staring back at them. The line between my wheat and their manicured lawns had never been more defined. At 7:15 sharp, a sleek white Mercedes came screeching down the boulevard, brakes squealing as it skidded to a stop. Karen climbed out, her silk pajamas poorly hidden beneath a hastily thrown blazer, her hair disheveled but her expression still twisted into that same smug mask. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, storming toward me with the confidence of someone who had always gotten her way. I stood with my hands in the pockets of my overalls, calm and steady. "Just bringing in equipment to clear a hazardous obstruction from my property, ma'am." Her eyes darted to the sea of machines behind me, and for the first time, I saw something crack in her. Panic. She spun toward the gathering crowd of residents, their faces lined with confusion, suspicion quickly turning to anger. "You can't intimidate us with this circus," she spat. Before I could respond, Tom Whitaker stepped forward, a thick folder of documents tucked under his arm. "Actually, ma'am, this is all perfectly legal. Every piece of equipment is sitting on Mr. Collins' land." He paused, his voice carrying so that every gathered resident could hear. "And perhaps now would be a good time to explain to your neighbors why their HOA fees were used to fund fraudulent surveys, illegal construction, and land theft." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People began to exchange looks, their confusion deepening into outrage. "Our survey is perfectly legitimate," Karen snapped. "No, it's not," Tom said firmly. The survey markers were moved 38 inches from their original positions, as documented in county records and confirmed by historical aerial photographs dating back to 1983. "Your grand entrance, the fountains, the stone archways, they sit 7 feet onto Mr. Collins' property." Gasps echoed. Karen's face paled. "Furthermore," Tom continued, "your drainage system has been redirecting water into federally protected wetlands. A criminal violation of environmental law." An elderly man in the crowd, Dr. Robert Harris, a retired civil engineer, stepped forward. "I raised concerns about that during construction, and you told me it had been resolved." Karen tried to rally. "This is all being handled. Return to your homes." But the tide had turned. Another voice cut through the noise. "Is that why our HOA fees went up 20% last quarter? And did you think we wouldn't find out that your brother-in-law owns the survey firm and your son owns the construction company?" I watched Karen's expression collapse into something between panic and desperation. Her eyes darted between angry neighbors and rumbling machinery, and for the first time, I think she realized she was no longer in control. Sheriff Bill Carter's cruiser rolled up just as the crowd's murmurs turned to shouts. He stepped out, tipped his hat toward me. "Morning, Henry." "Morning, Bill." "Property dispute?" "Among other things," Tom said dryly, handing over the thick folder. Bill scanned the documents, his brow furrowing. "Looks like more than a dispute. Looks like fraud and criminal mischief." Karen sputtered, trying to protest, but the voices in the crowd rose over hers, demanding answers. Her allies had evaporated. Karen's voice faltered, her words drowned beneath the growing roar of outrage from the very people she once commanded with iron authority and manicured charm. The residents of Whispering Pines weren't sipping their morning coffee anymore, they were demanding explanations. Faces flushed with anger, arms crossed, fingers pointing. I stood silently, arms folded, watching the house of cards crumble. Thomas Grant, who I'd only known as the polite retired judge who attended the county fair each year, stepped forward with the measured calm of a man used to restoring order in chaos. He raised a hand and the murmurs softened. As acting vice president of the social committee, and in the absence of trust in the current leadership, I propose an immediate vote of suspension for Ms. Whitfield, pending investigation. "You can't do this," Karen shouted, spinning to face him. "Seconded," came Linda Foster's voice, loud and clear from the center of the crowd. "All in favor?" Thomas called. It was as though a tidal wave of raised hands crashed upward all at once, arms lifted without hesitation. "The motion carries," Thomas said without a flicker of hesitation. Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing, grasping for some kind of lifeline. None came. She turned in a slow circle, looking for allies, but the residents' expressions ranged from betrayed to furious. Some had been loyal to her until this very moment, now they saw her clearly for what she was. And then the final blows landed. Tom Whitaker pulled another document from his folder. For the record, the survey company that falsified these property lines is owned by Karen Whitfield's brother-in-law, and the construction company that placed those barriers is owned by her son. The crowd erupted into gasps and angry exclamations. A woman near the front, Susan Peterson, whom I'd only known from a few passing glances at town meetings, shouted, "Is that why you rushed this through while the Jennings family was out of town for their daughter's wedding? You waited until Henry was at the hospital so you could ambush him too." The pieces snapped together in the minds of the residents. I didn't need to say a word. They saw everything for what it was, not a simple dispute, but a deliberate, calculated theft dressed in legality and hidden behind wine tastings and charity events. A younger man called out, "What about the $95,000 earmarked for community beautification? That fountain wasn't supposed to cost more than 20 grand. Karen's lips trembled. "That's board business. You don't understand the complexities." Thomas shook his head. "Complexity doesn't excuse corruption." Sheriff Carter closed his notepad with a snap. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to cooperate fully. Blocking access to an agricultural property isn't just civil overreach, it's potentially criminal obstruction." I caught Karen's eye then, and for the first time, she truly looked afraid. Within minutes, under the supervision of Thomas and half the HOA board, the same construction crew that had placed those barriers began removing them, one slab at a time, each piece of concrete hoisted up by the crane and lowered onto waiting flatbeds like fallen monuments of arrogance. I stood back, the weight lifting off my chest with every removed barrier. Sam placed a steady hand on my shoulder. We watched in silence as the grand stone entrance was measured, surveyed, and confirmed, 7 feet of ornate brick and imported Italian stone sitting squarely on Collins' land. The residents' fury deepened. As the last barrier was lifted away, Thomas turned to me. "Henry, on behalf of the Whispering Pines community, I offer our sincerest apology. What she did doesn't reflect who we are." I looked out at the crowd. People who, just days ago, had looked at me like a stubborn relic now looked at me with respect and regret. I nodded. Maybe this is a chance to start fresh. Karen disappeared into her Mercedes and sped away without another word, leaving behind a community scrambling to pick up the pieces of her deception. In the days that followed, the weight that had pressed on my chest for months lifted with every sunrise. The barriers were gone, not just from my driveway but from between my family and the community that had once seemed determined to push us out. The grand entrance that had trespassed onto my land was dismantled, the ornate stone fountain relocated and rebuilt, this time within their rightful boundary lines. But the real transformation was quieter, more lasting. Whispering Pines wasn't just a neighborhood of strangers anymore. They came in droves that first weekend, not to complain, but to help. Families who once looked at my muddy boots with disdain now asked if their children could visit the farm to learn about the animals. Susan Foster spearheaded a new Good Neighbor program, where community volunteers came by to lend a hand during harvest season and buy fresh produce directly from my fields. The northern wetlands that Karen had tried to use against me became an educational preserve, co-funded by the new HOA board, with walking paths and signs teaching kids about conservation and why that land should never be paved over. I kept one chunk of those Jersey barriers, repurposed as the foundation of my new roadside farm stand. On market days, I sit behind it, selling sweet corn, tomatoes, and fresh honey to folks from both the farms and the subdivisions. The same hands that once pointed fingers at me now shake mine, grateful to know where their food comes from. I see their children climb into hay wagons and laugh, their parents snapping pictures against a backdrop of golden fields they once called an eyesore. Even the community newsletter changed. Instead of pushing for more restrictions and curfews, they now proudly feature the Collins farm as part of their local heritage. And last month, as autumn painted the hills in red and gold, we hosted the first ever harvest festival that brought farmers and city folk together, not divided by concrete, but united by something deeper. My granddaughter, now wide-eyed and giggling, rode her first hayride with Thomas Grant's grandkids sitting beside her, laughing as though there had never been barriers between us at all. I think about all of it now, sitting here on my porch as the sun dips low and the evening breeze carries the scent of fresh-cut hay and ripening apples. We didn't just defend the farm. We built something better. We turned concrete walls into stepping stones for understanding, and aggression into cooperation. But it only happened because I stood my ground when it mattered most. Now I look out at my fields, at the families walking the trails beyond, and wonder, how many others out there are still fighting their own battles against people like Karen? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or someone trying to push you out of what's rightfully yours? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.